There are moments in life when the quiet passing of time becomes louder than any dramatic event. Moments when the slow fading of a great figure becomes a tragedy not because of a single shocking incident, but because of the soft erosion of years, memories, and the silent weight of growing old. And today, at 94, the story of Robert Duvall is not defined by headlines, scandals, or sudden disasters. It is defined by something far more ordinary and far more heartbreaking. The simple, unavoidable truth that time spares no one, not even legends. Now, let us begin this unusually slow, deliberately uneventful, and quietly emotional journey. Robert Duvall's story, as it stands at the age of 94, is not the kind of tale that bursts into conversation with urgency. Instead, it drifts in softly, like a page turning on its own or a light breeze brushing across an old photograph. It is the kind of story that demands patience from the listener because its importance lies not in dramatic revelations, but in understanding the slow, steady movement of a life that has carried the weight of almost a century. To understand the tragedy of Robert Duvall at 94, one must first appreciate the kind of quiet simplicity that ultimately defined him. Even though the world often associates him with the hardest, roughest characters ever put on screen, whether it was the hard-edged Major Kilgore, the stern but soulful Tom Hagen, or the countless men of the American frontier, Duvall's reality behind all of it was profoundly unremarkable in the most human way. He was a man who valued stillness, not silence stillness, a distinction he made often, though rarely aloud. Silence, he thought, could be uncomfortable or heavy or even unsettling. Stillness, however, was a presence, something that lived in between heartbeats, something that softened a room without erasing its character. And as the years went on, stillness became a kind of companion. But stillness also has a darker side, one that grows deeper in old age. At 94, Robert moves slower. Not in the dramatic sense of a man suddenly weakened, but in the subtle way a tree grows old-rooted, quiet, bending gently but never breaking. The tragedy here is not defined by disaster. Instead, it is a tragedy born from watching time slowly, persistently, reshape a legend into someone the world almost forgets to look at. Because in the modern landscape of entertainment, when noise becomes the measure of value, a man like Robert who preferred quiet becomes a shadow too easily overlooked. The strange thing about aging, particularly for someone who has lived a life so deeply intertwined with the public, is that the world eventually moves forward without asking permission. New actors rise, new stories dominate the cultural conversation, and newer generations grow up without the same reverence for the pillars of the past. For Robert, this transition was neither sudden nor painful. It was gradual, like the dimming of a lamp. He accepted it, and that, in itself, is part of the heartbreak. There is something quietly devastating about a man who understands that fame is temporary, recognition is seasonal, and legacy, though powerful, is not something one gets to experience firsthand. At 94, he does not chase attention. He does not seek applause. He does not attempt to reclaim the spotlight. Instead, he watches the world with a kind of distant curiosity, like someone observing a parade from a window, not lonely but detached. Peaceful, and yet undeniably fading in the eyes of those who once considered him larger than life. But what makes this even more tragic is that people often assume tragedy must be loud. They expect tears, collapse, catastrophe, but Robert Duvall's tragedy is quieter. It is the tragedy of days that feel longer not because they are filled with suffering, but because they are filled with less. Less conversation, less movement, less noise, less recognition, less urgency, When a man reaches 94, the world begins to treat him differently, often with the gentle caution one offers to something fragile. And Robert, who once embodied some of the strongest and most commanding characters ever written, is now seen through that softened lens. Respectful, yes. Admiring, certainly, but softened. As though people are afraid to speak too loudly around him, afraid to disrupt the peaceful decline of age. If one sits with Robert long enough, in the quiet of an afternoon when the shadows stretch across the room, one might begin to feel the weight of his years not as a burden, but as a presence. The presence of someone who has lived long enough to watch the world change in ways he never expected. And this awareness creates a different kind of sadness. A sadness rooted not in fear, but in acceptance. Acceptance that life is now a long, slow chapter rather than an unfolding narrative. Acceptance that the applause that once roared like thunder now echoes only in memory. Acceptance that the stories he once brought to life, the characters he once embodied, now belong more to history than to the present. And perhaps the most heartbreaking acceptance of all, that he is now a quiet observer of the world he once shaped so powerfully. Even the home he lives in, quietly tucked away from the noise of Hollywood, reflects this slow passing of time. Rooms filled not with extravagance, but with the traces of a life lived long, photographs resting on shelves, old scripts whose pages have yellowed at the edges, and the gentle clutter of memories that accumulate when one stops trying to impress and simply allows the years to settle. Robert doesn't speak often these days, not out of physical limitation, but simply because the need to speak has faded. When he does speak, his voice is softer, not weaker, but calmer, and each sentence is crafted with the patience of someone who no longer feels the pressure to fill silence. This is the kind of tragedy most people never talk about. To slow, and yet this slow tragedy is perhaps the most universal one. The quiet, steady fading of a long life nearing its final chapters. But what becomes even more quietly heartbreaking is what happens in the mind of a man who has witnessed so many decades pass before him. Robert Duvall's memories stretch back so far, reaching into times that barely feel real to younger generations. He remembers a world without the internet, without modern cameras, without digital screens lighting up every corner of daily life. He remembers the feel of film reels, the rhythm of old studios, the smell of stages and scripts printed on coarse paper that seemed to carry the weight of the story within them. Yet now, at 94, many of those memories come to him not as vivid moments, but as softened impressions like shadows flickering across the walls of his mind. They are still there, but they no longer arrive with the sharp clarity of youth. Instead, they drift in slowly, linger briefly, and fade before he can fully hold on to them. This, too, is a quiet tragedy, a gentle unraveling of experiences that once defined him. He often sits in his favorite chair, one placed near a window that lets in the afternoon light. Outside, the world continues in its own relentless pace, cars passing, birds calling, people going about their routines with the same urgency that once drove his younger years. But inside, the pace is different. The hours stretch. The air feels still. The silence deepens. Robert's routine is simple now. Mornings begin slowly with the deliberate movements of someone who respects the fragility of age. A cup of tea, perhaps. A quiet moment spent staring at the pattern of sunlight on the floor. He doesn't rush anymore, not because he cannot, but because he no longer feels the need to. There is something profoundly sad about watching a man who once lived so vibrantly settle into a life measured more by stillness than action. And yet, there is a strange beauty in it too, not dramatic, not thrilling, but gentle. Occasionally, he receives letters from fans, some old enough to remember his earliest films, others young enough to have discovered his work through digital platforms that compress decades of his career into a few clicks. These letters mean more to him now than they ever did. He reads them slowly, sometimes twice, letting the words settle into the quiet of his thoughts. To the world, he may seem like a man whose name has started to fade into the background of history, but to those who write to him, he is still a giant, a presence, a legacy. But what makes the situation heartbreakingly tragic is that even these moments of appreciation do not spark the same fire they once did. The recognition feels distant, almost like an echo of something he once understood deeply. Age changes not only the body, but the relationship one has with the world around them.
Achievements that once carried tremendous pride now feel like artifacts stored behind glass, visible, respectable, but no longer reachable. There is a kind of emotional numbness that can develop when one grows old enough to outlive most of their peers. For Robert, this has been a quiet, accumulating sorrow. The number of people from his early career, friends, directors, fellow actors, has dwindled over time. Conversations that once filled rooms with energy are now memories. Names that once appeared frequently in his life are now spoken only when he reminisces. This loss is not explosive. It is not marked by a single event. It is a slow erosion of reality he has learned to accept, and this acceptance creates a kind of loneliness that no amount of admiration or legacy can truly ease. Sometimes, when he sits alone in the late afternoons, memories of his earlier years drift in like faint fragments of a distant dream. The early days of struggling through auditions, the unpredictable excitement of being cast in roles that would later define him, the camaraderie of film sets where laughter, stress, tension, and triumph live side by side. These recollections warm him, but also remind him of a world that has long moved on. His home, filled with relics of the past, resembles a museum more than a living space. Awards sit silently on shelves, unpolished and slightly dimmed by time. Photographs in frames show a man with sharper features, clearer eyes, and a posture untouched by age. These images capture moments of triumph, milestones of a celebrated career, and glimpses of a life lived under the scrutiny and admiration of millions. Yet now, they serve as reminders of how much has changed. One photograph in particular, a candid shot from a film set decades ago, seems to draw his gaze more often than the others. In it, he is surrounded by cast and crew, all of them laughing at something off camera. His expression is vibrant, full of life, confidence, and the energy of a man in his prime. When Robert looks at this photograph now, he sometimes feels as if he is looking at someone else entirely, not because he has forgotten who he was, but because the distance between then and now feels impossibly vast. And this distance, this emotional space between his past and present, is a tragedy of its own. For a man who once lived in the center of cinematic storytelling, Robert now exists at the edge of his own narrative, not forgotten, but quietly overlooked, not abandoned, but gently drifting into the final chapters of a long, slow-moving book. This metaphor feels especially appropriate when one considers how much Robert always loved the process of storytelling, not just the films themselves, but the roads that led to them. He was never the type who obsessed over fame. He did not chase headlines or crave constant attention. His love was for the craft, the shaping of characters, the careful study of human behavior, the depth of quiet moments between lines of dialogue.
And yet, as life slows down, even that love becomes harder to express. He no longer immerses himself in character studies or rehearses with the intensity he once possessed. The scripts that occasionally find their way to his table remain untouched for days, sometimes weeks. Not because he lacks interest, but because he lacks the energy to engage with them fully. This is the tragedy many people never see. The loss of passion, not from disinterest, but from exhaustion. Living to 94 is a gift, but it is also a burden. One carries not only memories, but the weight of time itself. And Robert, with all his years, feels that weight more each day. He is surrounded by reminders of who he once was: a powerful actor, a respected storyteller, a cultural icon. But he also lives with the awareness of who he is now: a quiet elderly man watching the world from the soft glow of his living room, listening to the faint hum of passing cars, and waiting for the next day to arrive without expectation or urgency. This waiting, this unhurried existence, is where the tragedy hides. Not in suffering, not in pain, but in the profound stillness of a life slowing to its final rhythm. And yet, despite all of this, he remains gracious. He remains gentle. He remains at peace with the slow retreat of his own story. Because in the end, Robert Duvall understands something most people spend their lives attempting to learn. That time will always win, but peace can still be found in the quiet surrender to its passage.